Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, any agency of the U.S. government, Norwegian Defence University College, or their Norwegian government. So this is a special episode we're bringing to you today because we get to sort of talk to one of our in-house personnel here who've been with us for a while and finally get a chance to sort of sit down one-on-one and talk with him and learn more about what he's been doing here and what he's working on. So I'm here with Dr. Njord Wegge. He is here as the Chair of Arctic Security at Marine Corps University, but he's visiting us from Norwegian Defence University College and been here for a little more than a year, I think.
6 months. Only 6 months.
But you did visit us.
Sure, I've been engaged, with different research projects before.
Yeah. So in those 6 months, we've sort of established some very positive informal connections, which are looking to blossom into a formal connection between us and Norwegian Defence University College. So appreciate you taking the time to sit here and talk, and we're going to pick your brain a little bit about what you've been working on, as well as some of the security perspectives in the Arctic and High North region. They're obviously of top priority for Norway, but an emerging area of concern for the United States and the larger NATO alliance. So, but before we get into that, if you could just tell us a little bit about your professional background and your position here, Chair of Arctic Security, what you're doing here at Marine Corps University.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so my name is Njord Wegge. I'm a professor at Norwegian Military Academy. That would be the equivalent to West Point here in the United States, which is a part of the greater Norwegian Defence University College. And I'm a political scientist, a professor, and I've been working a lot on international relations, especially the Arctic, for a decade. And I took my PhD at the University of Tromsø in the far north of Norway, and has had an interest in Arctic issues. So the last few years, when I've been working at the Norwegian Military Academy, Defence University College, I thought, I'll really try to go a little bit more into the specific of the military power dimension of the Arctic, air, land, sea power. How does that matter? And when I came here to the Krulak Center in Marine Corps University, I really want to, try to understand better the American component of NATO's defense of the northern flank. The Marine Corps has been very important for Norway for very many years, and we have a very deeply established cooperation. So when I came here about half a year ago, I really tried to dig into that, utilizing my opportunities here as a professional political scientist working on security in this very exciting environment.
Yeah, well, it's been fantastic to have, as I said, area of emerging concern for the United States and NATO, and it's been great to have, a first person perspective on what the concerns are up there. So sort of with that, well, before we get right into some of the specific subject we're going to talk about, you were generous enough to provide a few pieces you've been working on that talk about some different aspects of security out there that you've been working on, but also sort of highlights what is going on there and what still needs to be done. So, for the benefit of our audience, could you maybe summarize, from Norway's perspective? Like I said, this is a area of primary concern because it is your home, your backyard. What are your main national security concerns up in the Arctic High North region right now?
Sure. So I would say in the big picture, the Arctic is a relatively low tension, stable region. It has been, comparatively speaking, pretty stable. A lot of cooperation have been taking place there internationally. So there's no need to think of an emerging crisis in the Arctic. However, the Arctic is a part of the global picture. We have a war in Ukraine. The relationship between NATO and Russia is really bad, and it's hard to have a time you can compare with when it comes to like the sort of like uncertainty for the future. So even though there's no imminent threats necessarily against, let's say, Norwegian sovereignty or NATO as an alliance in the north, the greater sort of picture of instability, war in Europe, uncertainty about the future, including, you know, where's Russia going, that is also impacting the situation in the north and of course Norwegian security. So sharing a border with Russia in the far north up by the Barents Sea makes Norway vulnerable, of course, if things, you know, escalate, if something triggers NATO-Russia relations, and especially thinking about how Russia have their northern military district and their northern fleet very close to the Norwegian border, where many of their most potent, you know, submarines, strategic asset, for example, their second strike capability with strategic submarines are located. So Norway would always, given this proximity to Russia and its geographic location, be, you know, a very important neighbor country for Russia. And now with these times of uncertainty, one has to, you know, be prepared. And I think today there's a new sense of realism in that we have to be prepared. The Norwegian Armed Forces, NATO has to actually be ready to operate in this part of the world, which is demanding. And after having had, you know, the 90s, the early 2000s focused on global war and terror, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., to sort of like recalibrate, focusing more on territorial defense of NATO. That's a new task which needs to to be moved forward.
Yeah, actually, that feeds really well to the next question, which is, you know, as your Norway borders Russia, so that's already your concern. You know, if Sweden and Finland, who are looking for, you know, NATO accession, if they do join NATO, that's only going to increase the length of the border that NATO occupies. You know, which is going to make the ability of other NATO forces to operate with, you know, those countries, as well as improve its operations previously standing with Norway. It's going to make it very important. But as you mentioned in a number of these pieces and just now, there's a lot of challenges to operating specifically in that environment. And there, within those challenges, though, some of those NATO forces, you know, to include the United States, as you noted, which have been optimized for operations in a it's not a nicer environment per se. You know, the desert is not a nice place, but very different set of environmental challenges for operating up in the high north. So could you describe maybe what some of those challenges are and sort of where you see that gap between, you know, sort of current NATO and United States capability and what they would need to get to operate effectively there?
Sure. So just before I do that, let me also comment on the NATO expansion, Sweden, Finland, that you raised. So I think it's very likely that those two countries will, you know, join. Exactly when, it's a broader political question, of course, that needs to be solved. However, it is a very, very significant change compared to what we have had in the northern flank since the origin of NATO, basically back in the 1940s. So almost, or maybe doubling the border towards Russia, of course, have a very, very large strategic importance. Defense plans need to be rewritten. I think definitely it has a positive effect on stability and security in the north. I think Sweden and Finland have great assets that they can contribute with. But as you also mentioned, I mean, the border gets much longer, more to protect. So that's an interesting development that definitely, you know, would strengthen NATO's capabilities in the north, in the Arctic. And so to your second part here, so what needs to be done? I mean, I think we could say there's a lot of different eras that has to be, you know, updated and thought about. You have the individual level where the individual soldier or, you know, unit needs to be able to keep warm, you know, protect their gear, their batteries, to be able to operate with their electronic devices. I mean, there's a lot of specific challenges on a very like micro level here. And if you aren't able to, fix those very simple questions, it's usually making you unable to operate it whatsoever. So you have a lot of individual challenges, and the same goes with like more the operational level with the joint force trying to connect to different parts of it, and how should we do this if there's specific challenges with communication, for example, or satellite coverage. There's examples where you just know one aren't prepared for snow, or you can't leave the roads, for example, because it's snow everywhere or it's like mud. There's a lot of operational, let's say, battalion level and brigade level challenges that are very unique when you have an Arctic climate. And of course, you have the strategic picture where more like the policy level and the planners, the strategic thinkers need to, actually start caring about, how should we get in fuel? What about supply of food, water? A whole lot of strategic issues that are not so easy because the distances are so long. And having Russia there with very capable anti-access air denial systems, submarines, etc., that could, prevent NATO to resupply and get personnel and hardware over. It has a lot of implications to be able to operate there with your full strength, and NATO is not there today.
Yeah, I noted one of the things you noted was the infrastructure. Getting past the environmentals of it's cold and it's extremely cold, and it's going to impact everything, like you said, from the human performance to equipment performance, but not a lot of infrastructure to either to get stuff there or to move it sort of across that theater. Definitely something that you need to practice. And if we haven't practiced it, then that's going to be a tough challenge when, if the day comes when we have to do it in an actual operation.
I think in practice, often large allied units in, let's say, northern Norway during wintertime now are pretty much bound to the road system, and maybe houses with heating. The moment you have to, go beyond the road systems and infrastructure with houses and electricity, you need some skills and special setups, and that's not necessarily in place now. So that's just like one very simple example of things that needs to be prepared for and improved.
Yeah. So looking at the sort of the Russian posture up there now, you mentioned that there's the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. It has caused significant degradation to some of the ground forces that they pulled out of there. So a lot of the whether it's naval infantry or mechanized or airborne air assault type units, they've been pulled out of where they're based up in the north, flung into Ukraine, and a lot of them are sort of in tatters, at this point. So the ground piece definitely degraded, but as you just noted now, and in some of these articles here as well, their naval and aviation capabilities still remain strong, to include submarine, which has always been a sort of a strong point for them. So you noted in one of the pieces that because of the lack of degraded ground forces, but other capabilities still there, we're likely to see Russian hybrid operations up in that area as a preferred method for them to contest, to challenge, and to otherwise sort of interfere in a way that their ground forces are not really able to do anymore. So what are some of these hybrid operations that Norway and the rest of NATO and potentially Sweden, Finland need to be watchful for, and what can both NATO and the currently non-NATO northern countries do to counter Russian hybrid warfare in the high north?
Sure. So actually, the Washington Post yesterday, Sunday 15th, I guess, they had an article about 200 motorized rifle brigades conditions now after being destroyed partly in Ukraine. It's very telling how severe the damages has been. And so I read that yesterday with great interest, and some of what you argue here is that with a weakened military land capability, I mean, what kind of threats can we see the Arctic, a land invasion is very unlikely. And together with a colleague, Colin Wall at the CSIS, we're writing an information brief these days on that topic, where we also look into the possibility of, an increased, like say, hybrid threats scenario, where you have not necessarily clear-cut threats that could be directly attributed to Russia, but that are highly likely, perhaps, and where it could be, for example, drones or sabotage, etc. And in a situation where tensions are high, lack of traditional military capabilities, I think it's likely that Russia would, explore that blurred area between peace and war to a degree, try to reach their political goal while not necessarily triggering an Article 5 scenario with NATO. That's sort of like the core argument for what is a hybrid threat or hybrid warfare or hybrid influence, etc. So we've in Norway recently had quite a few episodes where, for example, Russians have flied drones and been arrested. There's also been people arrested for espionage, etc. And I would say it's a pattern where one can see, a greater pressure, perhaps, on Russia's allies in the situation with greater tensions, where Russia don't have capacity or interest or maybe any intentions to deepen the conflict with NATO, or there's not like a conflict now, it's more like a political conflict, of course, but to sort of like push on those buttons they know they'll get a pretty clear reply to. But when they are like exploring more less defined borders, for example, I didn't mention jamming or GPS systems. I mean, there's a lot of like methods you could perhaps try to create a narrative, partly reaching goals, try to destabilize maybe. So distrust to democracy as an institution, right? I mean, there's a lot of areas where one have seen likely influence campaigns from Russia, for example, and in the current security climate, I think definitely that is one area one should be aware of that could be beefed up, and where one has to be on the alert and be ready for new threat scenarios. And
So what are some options for countering that? Like, for example, you just mentioned like the influence campaigns going after, legitimacy of the democratic process. From the Norwegian perspective, have those operations been attempted? And if so, what's sort of the government response been to try and push that back?
So I think it has been a process now where just to be aware of it has been very important. After the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, it was a new level of sort of awareness that gradually spread, let's say, among decision makers on the policy level, let's say in Ministry of Defense, Foreign Affairs, etc. However, in these days, I think also within the broader public and in the population, there's a new sense of realism in uncertainties of our time, where, the clear-cut division between peace and war seems to be a little bit outdated in a way. There's obviously events that aren't really fitting here. For example, I mean, the sabotage of the Nord Stream 1 and 2. I mean, what is that? I mean, even though there's no clear evidence of, a specific actor, this is obviously, or this looks very obviously to be, an intended event, which definitely needs some very capable tools to be successful to execute that operation.
There's only so many nations out there who could pull
so
it off.
I mean, it's likely to think about state actors, etc. So I think with the current security climate, current events, there's a broader sort of like awareness that these type of threats are real. So one thing the government or the appropriate agencies should do is probably to spread information, to counter misinformation, try to go after false claims or planted facts, etc. So and also maybe, for example, utilize the Home Guard. We have had episodes now where the Home Guard has been mobilized for a long time to try to protect gas and oil installations on the coast of Norway, for example, to sort of have a network of information, also detection. I mean, how should you report if you see something suspicious? How can you put this together? I mean, so the entire civil society, the Home Guard, and the central government seems to sort of like operate a little bit more on the same page these days, and I think that's something of the most important thing they can do.
Great, thank you. So, kind of moving on to like sort of a larger perspective here is, how does Norway see its role in the defense of the Arctic? Especially within the context of the NATO alliance, because Norway's been again, that's been their front line since they joined the NATO alliance. And, from my own historical study, the relationship with the Marine Corps in Norway, that was defending the high north, defending access to the Atlantic sea lanes, or denying that access to then Soviet, now Russian naval capabilities was a key part of that. So how does Norway see its role up there today? How can other NATO countries and the United States contribute to that defense in the future? And then maybe if you could talk about that as well in sort of the context of what you mentioned in a couple of the articles here, which is the under the Force Design 2030, Marine Corps institutional change approach right now, the stand-in force has been a sort of a key term in that, right? Like how we're gonna do Force Design 2030 is, well, if we're already there inside the opponent's weapon engagement zone, that's an advantageous place to be, right? Like we're already in where we want to be. But you mentioned in here that maybe another way to look at the force design concept of stand-in force is Norway's already there, right? Your military, your Home Guard, all those assets are already there. Does that become the stand-in force? And then what does that do to sort of change the context of Norway's role in defense of the Arctic?
Yeah, good question. So I think the fact that we live in the Arctic, we have a population that have kids, grow up, go skiing, are used to put on the flashlight during winter when you're out playing in the north. At least we did that when we lived in Tromsø with our kids in the weekend. So there's an advantage in just being there, having your normal life when it comes to also being able to operate there. So I think many of the basic skills related to let's say Norwegian culture, ability to have fun and do sport and live outside, that's of value when it comes to also leading military operations or participating in a military operation in that demanding climate. And I think the Scandinavian countries, when it comes to having lots of people with those skills, or like deeply integrated, that could be shared. I think one could think about liaison arrangements, or not only exchange or visiting for exercises. There are a lot of ways those type of skills could be utilized. When it comes to your good question, or the point I've been writing about in some forthcoming publications here on how could we utilize perhaps the local forces like the Norwegian Armed Forces, potentially Swedish, Finnish in the future as like a stand-in force. Yeah, I think that's true. That's the way to look at it. We are small, but quite technically advanced, more or less the same level as many of the American units, with like very high-tech, top-notch investments at least, and to try to seamlessly operate together on exercises and during peacetime in control forms, trying to work on the problems perhaps with communication, crypto issues. I mean, there's a lot of things that needs to be solved, but to have an ambition of integrating, for example, Norwegian Armed Forces up north in a joint sort of multi-domain operation fashion would definitely be, I think, something we should work for, and which could be realistic, but needs a lot of practice and trust, of course, and partner training and exchange. So yeah, I think that's the way to go, definitely.
Yeah, and I I'm not trying to read a crystal ball, but I would probably, given, one, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and then two, looking at, they border a lot of other countries, and the security dynamic up there is changing. I would not be surprised if, we start seeing more of that liaison and more of that joint training integration. And I know, I'm trying to think if it was back earlier this summer or earlier this year, but the Marine forces continue to rotate out through there and conduct exercises, partly because we have all the equipment pre-staged, but also is, part of the recognition that that's a key area, for a number of reasons, for security concerns, given Russian aggression again, where else might they want to go, but also that area of the world, it's opening up potentially for, economic use, trade use, all these other things, which is going to only make it more important. So being able to operate up there is only going to increase in importance, and probably see that down the road. But I'll just one more note, and then I'll wrap up here. But I thought your context of, using the Norwegian forces, like think of them as the stand-in force, that really cut to something that, and I know in the Krulak Center and some of the war games that we've run, as well as I think more broadly across some areas inside the Marine Corps, in the context of force design, is this understanding that we are never going to be somewhere alone. There's always going to, everywhere we go, it's somebody else's home, right? They will have people there, they will have forces and capabilities there. And so we really need to, one, we need to understand that simple data point, but it can get overlooked a lot. Like we've tried to be better about this in our war games, but a lot of older war games, it's always like, US versus, Russia or China. And like the other people who live there, right, whose home it is, are just simply not present on the map. So I think that context of the stand-in force is really useful to help reinforce, like, somebody's already there first, right? The people who live there, whose home this is, who this is the front line for. So, and you brought up in the papers, like access, like if you're outside the West, getting into it again forcibly is going to be hard. But guess what? You already have forces inside the West, your partners, your allies in there. So
and I was
think about that.
The fact that these are, very long-term allies. So Norway was one of the founding members of NATO, and we've been cooperating, for decades. And there's a lot of trust and personal relationships, and also similarities when it comes to equipment. For example, F-35s and very last sort of version, 5th generation systems, etc., which makes it easier. And of course, let's say within anti-submarine warfare, the British, Norwegian, American cooperation seems to be developing pretty good with the P8s. So I think there's a lot of potential also on the, for example, land side here, and the U.S. Marines. And the U.S. Marines will probably not be, a major land-bound fighting force in the future high north in Europe. I mean, you have a littoral focus with Force 2030. Maybe the U.S. Army will be more important. But to have the Marines there in the littoral regions, on the shores, and connecting the joint force to the theaters, that would be highly relevant. And definitely Norway as a long time, and with very good relationship both ways, should definitely be able to have that role in the future.
Yeah, and I think given that long-standing relationship, there's a very firm and deep foundation for that cooperation. Because I remember when the Norwegian ambassador to the United States came last year for the Arctic Symposium, I remember she threw up pictures of Norwegian F-35s, right? Like a lot of common capabilities, which should make that ability to operate and complement each other better. We just have to do it, right? Do those exercises. Okay, so that kind of brings me to the end of my questions here, and we are getting up to the time we talked about. So any last comments or thoughts you'd like to share? Well,
I'll just thank you for the podcast, but also the time here at the Krulak Center, which has been great. We've had a good time here, and I've been impressed by all the activities that you're doing here around this intellectual hub, which I think we could say the Krulak Center is. So it has been a pleasure to be here, and thank you for this opportunity, and looking forward to the future.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you, Dr. Wegge. Thank you for your time as well. And we do try and be an intellectual hub, but it's been I think a good nexus of where different threads can come together, and create future opportunities, and it's not coincidence that yourself as a chair for Arctic security here at Marine Corps University, they put you in one of our offices sort of just on the other side of the building here to meet close. And it's not a coincidence that the visiting fellow from Swedish Defence University, was put there so that we can, I say we, but on behalf of Marine Corps University, create that hub so we can start looking at, hey, maybe 5 years down the road, right? We're doing really strong, energetic NATO, Norway, bilateral, joint training exercise, all that stuff. It all has to start with sort of knowing who's out there and establishing some of those relationships. And so I think that's why it's been tremendously valuable to have, yourself among the other folks who've been put here to start laying that groundwork for future development. So, all right, great. Again, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to your remaining time here at Marine Corps University.
Thanks.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.